All right, so now we're on to the ETL process. And before we get to SSIS within Visual Studios, there are a couple of things I want to go over. And the first thing I want to go over is this file we have here. So this file is called table data types, and this file contains all of the data set outputs from our Python scripts and a mock-up of the database schema. So if we take a look at the first tab here, which is called tables, this is something I basically created, where I went through all of the data set outputs that we had from our Python scripts. I went to each and every CSV file, and then I just took the column names, and then I created another column or two columns called data types and notes. And from there, I would assign each column name a specific data type, although this is not complete yet because for some of the data types, I need to add more information, like how long I want the string to be, like 100 or 500, like nvar char 500 or maximum. So it's not final, but it is final on the database schema tab, and we'll get to that soon. But I did add the data type column and the notes column as well, just to know if I needed to remember something or a table had something in particular, I could just look at that table and see there's a note there. So what's highlighted in green is going to be the main file or the main table in our database. So let's take this player list CSV for instance. We have this as the overall table, and then we have another Python script that looks for new incoming players that it is its own CSV file. So we would append any new information from this file to this main file here, or a table, because now we're speaking in the sense of databases and we are working with tables now. And the blue highlights represent anything or any script or file, that outputs or is updated more than once, and it's going to connect to a main green table. Hopefully this explanation provides some clarity. So you can see all of our green tables and all of our blue tables. And like I said earlier, the blue tables are the ones that are updated throughout the season or even every day. The ones in red are notes for me, or basically like a warning sign to not use those tables in SSIS. And the reason for this is because some of the outputs that we get from the Python script are sort of like a bridge file. So I don't necessarily look at them at all, but they're going to connect us to get into the end CSV file for that particular Python script. So now we can move on to the database schema tab. So the database schema tab, it's going to have all of our tables in here. Not all of the data sets, but all of the tables we need in our database. So you can see we have game listings, games played, a legend, and game results, and along with a variety of other tables that we scraped from the web. So here is more so of the complete table listing, because we even have a primary key set up. What's in bold and have two asterisks is a primary key. So in some tables we have a composite key, and in some tables we only just need one column as a primary key. And then you can also see here that the data type is fully completed. So nvarchar 100 or nvarchar 50, small n, or real data type. All of that information is filled out on this database schema tab. In addition, you could also see that I tried to set up some connections between tables we have in this tab as well. And originally, I thought the NFL team basic information was going to connect to all of the tables or a majority of the tables in this database, but due to referential integrity, that was not possible here. Because in our NFL team basic information CSV file, we only have team names that are currently in the NFL. And from 2010 all the way up to 2020 or even 2021, several teams have changed their names. Like the Oakland Raiders, they were first known as, is now the Los Angeles, the Los Angeles or Las Vegas Raiders, excuse me. And then you have the St. Louis Rams, who were known as the St. Louis Rams, of course, first, now changed their name to the Los Angeles Rams. And of course, those teams have relocated to different states as well. Let's take an example. In the NFL passing stats, we have statistics from 2010 to 2021, and we have the team name in there. If I wanted to connect the NFL team basic information to the NFL passing stats, that would not be possible because we have a team in here called the St. Louis Rams, but in this primary key table or in this primary table, we do not have a team called the St. Louis Rams. And because we're setting up a one-to-many relationship, that is not going to work. We could not have a value that exists in the foreign table and does not exist in the primary key table. So, as I mentioned earlier, St. Louis Rams is in this table, but it is not in the NFL team basic information table. And that violates referential integrity. And hopefully that makes a little bit more sense, but that's just the gist of the issue I came across. So I basically had to let these tables sit on their own, and there's always other ways to connect the information. We could always use joins or subqueries and things like that, and unions. It doesn't really affect us. So like I said, we have our primary key, we have our data types, and we have all of the tables that are going to be in the database. There's one table on here called injuries. Not called injuries, but called NFL years that I did not include on this sheet, but it is in the database schema in SSMS, and a majority of those tables connect to that NFL years table. And to talk about that table, it's basically going to contain years from like 2005 all the way up to like 2080. And then also you can see that every table has been imported. Once every table was imported, I went down and wrote a note next to the table. I gave the table the name that it had in our SSMS database, and I wrote if it was imported or not, or if when it was imported, or saying that it was imported. So SSIS imported. So that's basically it for this database schema tab, and I know it's not the best to look at. It's a lot more visually pleasing to look at in SSMS, but eventually we'll get there in this video. Last tab I want to look at is called the formulas tab. And because we had so many data sets and so many tables, I had to come up with a way to try and figure out, okay, I need to create these tables, but I need to find an effective way to create these tables quickly and most efficiently as possible. Because right now, at this point, well, everything's been created, but at this point where I was at, I had no tables created at all. So what I decided to do was to create a formula in Excel that will create a SQL script to create the tables I was working on specifically. So if I was working on the NFL passing stats table, I would have all of the NFL passing stats columns here along with the data types, and then from there Excel would do its formulas, or the formulas I created would create the SQL script, and then from there I would make any other adjustments or even add a primary key. And that's really all for this tab here. It's nothing too special, but it saved me a lot of time from creating the tables. And as I mentioned earlier, I created the tables in SSMS. So the tables were created in SSMS, but had no data loaded into them yet. And this is where SSIS eventually comes in, and we load in all of that data. So that's it for this file, and we can move on to Visual Studios now. Okay, so here is one of our first solutions in SSIS, and it's called NFL DB ETL, but this is the initial data load. As you can see, this is what I called it in the sequence container. So I'm gonna walk through of general sense of, or general overview of the steps I took to get the data loaded in, because right now we have our tables created and we have some connections made, but we do not have any data loaded into those tables yet. So this is where I explain my process. So the first thing, of course, is to come to the connection manager, and basically connect to any CSV file that we have relating to this project. And then you also want to connect to I also connected to the NFL DB database. So I'm going to take one example of a data task flow, and basically one of these data task flows is going to follow the same pattern as a majority of the others. Like, there isn't going to be a huge variance when it comes to how these task flows are structured. It's pretty straightforward, but the main thing is that you have to get your columns right. So let's take defensive stats for an example. So I have it in the connection manager here, and when I come to the connection manager and I click on defensive stats, the most important thing for me is to make sure my columns are configured properly so that SSIS can look at what's in the database table in SSMS and connect those two columns, because our column names are going to be exactly the same in SSMS. So it's imperative that all of these columns are figured correctly. And the thing about SSIS is that they do not use the same data types that SQL uses. Like, SQL will use nvarchar 100, but there's no nvarchar in SSIS. It seems in SSIS they have strings or data types used in SQL grouped. So nvarchar falls under Unicode string, and maybe varchar falls under Unicode string as well, but I'm not too sure. This is me making a inference. So this is why it's important to make sure that the columns match with what we have in the database. But ultimately, you could connect the two. And this is what our data set looks like, or this is what our CSV file looks like. So once we have that all set up and we're ready to go, I then created the task flow. And within the task flow, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to follow the same format as 95% of the other task flow within that container. So the first thing we do is create a flat file source, and that's basically connecting to that connection manager for that specific CSV file. So very simple here. And then the next thing I did was perform a lookup. And for the rows that have no match in our database table, we are going to send those rows to our database table, of course, because that would represent that the rows are new and not in the table. So that would means we have new rows and they are fine to be loaded into the database. Next, come to connection. Make sure we choose the right table we are looking at. And of course, we're looking at the defensive stats table. So this is coming from our database in SSMS. And if you preview, we have data already loaded in there, but when I did this the first time, there is no data, there was no rows at all in this table. And I know Cam Newton is an offensive player, but in the NFL, sometimes when you're on offense, you might be playing defense depending on if you turn the ball over or not. And then we have our columns. These are the columns we are going to look at when we're performing this lookup. So we have the uniform number, and we could get a better look at this. We have the uniform number, the player, the position, the year for that season, and the team name. This basically is the primary key in the defensive stats table. So one, this ensures we have no duplicates coming into the table, and two, for the rows that are already in the table, and for the rows that are already in the table and in the CSV file, we can redirect those rows to a different output, or we don't have to worry about them at all, because at the beginning we specify that for the rows that don't have a match, we are going to send it to this table. So we do not need to worry about the rows that do have a match, because nothing will be done with those rows. And then after that, of course, we send it to the database table, the defensive stats. And then the mappings are going to automatically assign themselves if they have the same column name. So this is why it's important that whenever you create a database, or like you're working with SSIS or maybe any other ETL tool, because the only one I really used was SSIS and a very little bit of Hadoop and Spark. So you want to make sure you have the same columns in the CSV file as you do in the database table, because it'll make life a lot easier when you have to select the input column and the destination column. Because if you do not have the columns with the same names, then you have to manually assign them. And if you have a lot of columns, it can be a little bit tedious. So that's how the data task flow looks like for 95% of the task or data flow task in this sequence container. And there's one more thing I want to mention. I did write a note here for the transaction data flow task, and there was something wrong with the Spot Rack site where we had duplicates. So I had to remove the primary key from this table, and I just don't know why Spot Rack had duplicates. So, but it was not that big of a deal. Maybe one or two rows had duplicates, and there's a multitude of ways we can go about it, but I decided just to remove the primary key because it's not going to be that important to me. Because if we look at that transaction data set, there's nothing that could really connect to any other table, so that's perfectly fine. We have one more package we need to go over, and that is called updating NFL tables. So we'll look at that right now. So this is the second solution, and it's the final solution that we have with SSIS for this particular project. And this solution is going to update any of the tables that are required to be updated, which is a majority of the tables in this project. For a handful of the tables, they are going to follow the same steps as the previous solution that we viewed. So that includes the process of getting the right configuration for the columns, the lookup and sending the rows that do not exist in the database into the database now, and that's basically it. But for some tables, or for the majority of tables in this solution, we have to do a little bit of extra work. And by extra work, I mean, creating a SQL script that drop the current season rows. And this is very important because this will clean up our database very nicely. And I'll go over an example on what I mean by that. So you can see new players, just going to follow the same concept. Whatever is not in the database table, but it is in the CSV file, look up no match, and we are going to put it in the database table. But I did mention that for a majority of the tables, they are going to have a SQL script associated with them. So keeping with the same example, we could look at the defensive stats, and we can take a look at the connection managers for the defensive stats. And I believe it's this one. So we have our columns configured, but this is the important part I want to go over. Because this file updates regularly based on the current NFL season with new numbers and new records, if we do not drop the rows that are associated with the current NFL season, we're going to have unnecessary rows. And what I mean by that is that if you take a look at Logan Thomas here, he has a record. Well, this is the end of the season, but picture we were beginning the NFL season and focus on games and games started. The script for this particular data set is going to be ran every week, and the update is going to happen every week as well. So the beginning of the season starts. Logan Thomas plays his first game, and he started his first game as well. So that would mean visually, we're looking at the 2021 season. He would have games as one, and then games started as one as well. When we go to import that into the database, that is perfectly fine. We have no issue with that because that is its first instance of the 2021 season. But now, when we get to week 2, and Logan Thomas has played 2 games and he has started 2 games as well, but it's still within the current season, it is going to, the SSIS package is going to identify that as a new row or a duplicate, depending on how we created our lookup. But I say duplicate first because this is my thought process, or this is how I thought about it first. So now in our database, we have one row for Logan Thomas that has him listed as 1 game played and 1 game started. Then we have another row for Logan Thomas that has him listed as 2 games played and 2 games started. That's information, that's an overload of information, I would call it, because we don't need that. What the Pro Football Reference site is going to do for us is that it's going to aggregate all of that data for Logan Thomas week by week. So instead of having multiple rows for him, they're just going to add it up and put it all together. And we need to perform the same thing in our database. So this is why we drop all of the rows that are related to the current season. And I hope that explanation makes sense. So I started off with the year 2020 because the latest data available to us is the 2020 season, because the 2021 season hasn't started yet. But I'm pretty confident that when the 2021 season starts, it's going to be the same process. I should have no hiccup at all, and if I do, it should be easy to fix. So since we went over that, we could look at the SQL script. So basically, before I made the change, we are going to delete anything that relates to the current NFL season. In our case, because we had 2020 data, before I changed this, I had where defensive year equal DV, where defensive year equals 2020 instead of 2021. But now, since the season is upcoming, I have to change it to 2021. And because the season is played in two parts, I have to try and figure out a way to automatically get it to update to the current NFL season. But that's something I'll probably have to come back down the road to. But for right now, how this method is that it works perfectly fine. So it's going to drop all the rows for that current season, and then whatever in that CSV file is going to get imported into the database again, because we have no rows now in our database. We have deleted everything that relates to the current NFL season. So those new rows, or all of the rows in that current defensive season stats CSV file, they should be good to be imported. So right now the rows are dropped. Then we go through the process of reading in the flat file, performing the lookup no match, and then sending all of those rows to the database. And that's basically it. There is one more thing I want to go over, and that is the error that I made earlier in the Python coding section. So there are a couple errors that I made, and the first one here you could probably see is oops. And the first one I made was that I included the team total rows in the passing stats, and all we did was just create a script to drop the team total rows. That was pretty easy. But one that was a little bit more challenging was that I incorrectly scraped one of the columns in the team stats. So that would consist of team stats, team conversions, third down, or yeah, same thing. And what I had to do was basically still following the same steps, but we had to create a derived column using the replace function. So you can see here that I'm looking at the player team conversion column, and I'm going to basically update the values to accurately reflect what's on the Pro Football Reference site, because we had a value called player in there, and it's not supposed to be player, it's supposed to be called team stats, and team stats is supposed to be called opponent stats. And so with this replace function, it helps us accurately reflect what's on the Pro Football Reference site without touching the tables in the database that have already been imported. So we won't affect anything in the database, but we are going to make that change in the flat file source. And then all of those changes we are now going to roll with when we perform our lookup. The first time I did this in the initial data load, I created a script just for that one time. But I had to think of a repeatable solution, and this was the solution I came up with. So now all of those errors would be fixed. And it's 7:30, so actually this is a database I have set up to run at 7:30 to update. So I'm not sure if it's going to update or not because I have the file open. I'm not sure if that affects it, but I could still run it and it should work properly. But I want to check, but let's give it a run here. I'm going to give it one more minute just in case it's running in the background and I don't want to overstep any boundaries it's running on. So yeah, it's a file that takes maybe a minute to update, and we could go ahead and see how it looks here. So voila, all green, all good to go. This is one of the most satisfying things for me, because getting SSIS to work, especially the first time around, was a headache. And now the more you work with it, the better you become. And it's just all about practice and consistency. So with the data loaded in and it's August 19th, Thursday, we can actually go and check to see what's been uploaded. So before we look at what's been uploaded into the database for today, I want to go over the job that I created to update that SSIS script. And it's very simple. Shouldn't take more than like a minute or two. Basically, we are going to look at the file we have, and it's going to run Monday through Sunday. It's going to run every day at 7:30, so that's why I was a little bit more patient to run that script there when we were actually viewing the file, because I didn't want to mess up anything. And all it's going to do is just look at the SSIS file, run it, and then from SSIS update the table. In my last project, I had this done by the task scheduler, but I wanted to make sure everything is integrated with the Microsoft ecosystem, or Microsoft BI ecosystem. So you can see here, we're looking at file system. We set the type to SSIS, or SQL Server Integration Services package, and then we have our file here. And then I also have another job that sends me an email wherever to my desktop or to my phone, telling me what jobs have been run for the day and what succeeded and what did not succeed. So far, everything is succeeding, and that's because we have everything with a repeatable solution. Because I'm still using my last project, and those queries are still running, so it's very vital that I get an update. Even though I may not look at the report every day or like for weeks at a time, it's important that everything is still running pretty smoothly. And I did promise to show the database schema for this one, for the NFL DB. And you can see it's a lot more connection, because as I mentioned, we had the years table, and that's basically going to connect to all of the tables in our database schema. But that's really much it. That's really it for the connections for these tables. You know, some tables have connections to other tables other than the year, but for right now, the year is the one that's holding it down for a lot of these tables. So this is what our database schema looks like. So even though the tables are not connected, we can always use a join. Now let's take a look at some of the new information that has been uploaded into our database now or today. So we're going to use NFL DB, and not every table is updated because the NFL season hasn't started yet, so there's no new information for some of the tables. But there are several tables that I know updates daily, and one of them is transactions, or the transaction table. So if we write a quick query, we can see the new entries for today. So as you can see, today was August 19th. Our query was ran. Not a lot of transactions today. Pretty slow day in the NFL based on spot rack. And you can see Micah Simon was waived by the Carolina Panthers. And we have his profile link here and the player pick. Probably not a lot of movement in the NFL today because players are practicing, teams are practicing. So, you know, they wait until they hit that next preseason games to make all of those cuts, or the day after the preseason game. The other table that updates daily is the injury tables, or the injuries table, excuse me. And this is not a good column name to have, but for now, it is what it is. So again, new data, August 19th, AJ Brown was out with the undisclosed injury. So the Tennessee Titans, 3 players were injured for them today, so not pretty good, I guess you could say. And I wouldn't worry about this. This is just how CBS Sports have their website set up. One more table I believe is updated daily is the news table. And that is going to consist of every NFL team that had an article written about them. So as you can see, August 19th as well. The Arizona Cardinals players to watch in preseason week 2. Preseason week 2. I believe they're playing some games today. They're playing some NFL preseason games today. This is week 3 out of 4, but we don't have anything for the preseason here. We want to look at regular season, and postseason. We're going to put all of this information together in a Power BI report. The headline link is going to be linked to the article in the picture. You can see a picture before you click the link, and then you also have the headline title. So working with SSIS this time around was not hard at all. It was just a lot more tedious to get right because we had so many columns that we had to match to the database in SSMS, and there were a lot of tables this time. I believe there's around 16 tables. So trying to connect all of them and getting them all configured properly took some time, but with dedication and patience, we eventually got it done. And with the NFL season upon the horizon, I'm hoping to have updated information weekly, daily, or even hourly if I decide to change it. But with that, we can now move on to the queries, stored procedures that are going to be eventually used in Power BI.